Hi, I'm Angelo the BA, and this is a quick tutorial on how to write effective user stories. Before we dig too deep into writing the user stories, the first thing I want to talk about are the principles of Agile, which should be kept in mind while you're writing your user stories. There's four primary principles. The first is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. This means you're working as a team to get done whatever it is that you're getting done, which means when you're doing the work that you're doing, you should be focusing on the people and the interactions that are going to help you get it done, and not just blindly following processes and tools just because you have them, or using tools just because you have them. Next is working software over comprehensive documentation. In the waterfall world, a lot of times you're forced to create a lot of documentation that sometimes just doesn't get used. Whereas in Agile, it's all about writing down only what needs to be written down so that the software can be done and delivered in an effective way, and not creating a lot of wasteful documentation. Collaboration over contract negotiation. In waterfall, you're definitely working in a contract type of mentality where you write requirements, you get sign off, and whatever gets signed off, that's just what has to get done. It's kind of a no questions asked, just get this done and delivered kind of thing, versus collaboration where you give the opportunity to say, what if we do it this way? What about these things? Can we change? Can we work to make this better? And last but not least, but in the same vein, is adjusting to change over sticking to the plan. Same kind of thing. If that contract is set in stone and you realize it's dumb after the fact, you shouldn't keep on working with that same documentation. You should adjust to whatever the market is asking for or whatever the current needs are, instead of just being stuck with whatever was written down, being able to be open to adjust to the changing environment. Why invest? Invest is just another mnemonic to help remember how to keep yourself organized in your own mind on creating great user stories. Invest stands for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. The rest of this video is going to be going through each of these individually. However, we're not going to be going in this specific order because I'm going to split up writing the user story, that business value statement, versus writing the acceptance criteria, and some of these fit better for one instead of the other. User stories, writing the user story. User stories need to be valuable. You need to be able to ask for who and why you're writing that user story. An example of a user story that a lot of us get could be something straightforward like, hey, can you add a user story to add the customer linkages to the Active Directory? Long story short, Active Directory maintained the most basic, minimal user information so users could log in, whereas my application used that user information but also included other things like customer linkages. So we understand how those users are associated to customers. And this request was to say, we want those customer linkages that are created in your application to be also stored in our application. However, after digging a little deeper and asking more questions as to for who this applies to and why, what we learned was that as a partner user, we wanted to have the customer linkages available in our CRM tool so that they can seamlessly single sign-on into the application. Without that information being there, that single sign-on often failed. It's important to note that that format, as a I want so that, creates discipline and helps the team focus on the goal instead of the specific things that are being asked by individual stakeholders. Independent. Can this be worked on by itself? User stories have to be independent because in order for a sprint to be considered complete, you have to be able to complete all the different stories within that user or within that sprint. And if they're dependent on other stories, and for some reason that story that is dependent on doesn't get done, now your user story also doesn't get done, and it seems like you just couldn't get it done, but in truth, that story was just waiting on another story. So that can't happen in a sprint. So every story needs to be independent, meaning it could be worked on from start to finish, including testing and passing it. And it's also important to note that UI elements, data interface elements, and functional elements can be worked on independently without being connected up to everything. Another important one is small, and it kind of relates to being independent. Um, AgileForAll.com has a really great diagram of how to split your user stories so they end up small, so you can fit them in the sprint. You can learn quickly. A lot of what it's talking about here is basically saying if you have a function or a workflow or a feature that has a most basic MVP version, but then the user story includes all of those additional enhancements to make it really the gold standard. It's really saying you don't need to start with the gold standard. Maybe start with the most basic version of the solution and then continue building upon that sprint after sprint. And what that does for you is allows you to learn. So you implement something, learn about it, maybe make it adjustments, and then you can move on in the next sprint to enhance it in a more intelligent way instead of trying to get it all done at once and not giving yourself the opportunity to learn how it's actually functioning and how it might benefit to kind of pivot in a different direction. But you should definitely check out this diagram and read all the different parts. It'll help you really think about your user story writing and how to make them small and independent.